This room runs on silence, not confusion, Mercer said, his voice cutting clean through the low hum of encrypted servers and filtered air, the kind of voice that had never been questioned and had never needed to be. The SCF doors had sealed 30 seconds earlier with a hydraulic sigh, locking the world outside behind layers of reinforced steel and clearance protocols. And yet somehow, standing just inside that threshold, the old man didn't seem to belong to any of it. Arthur Kane stood with a slight lean against a worn aluminum cane, its shaft scratched and dulled by years of use, his frame thin but steady, his jacket a faded olive green that looked older than half the operators in the room. Around him, 12 Delta Force operators sat or stood in controlled stillness, their gear precise, their posture exact, their attention split between the glowing digital map projected across the far wall and the anomaly that had just walked into their classified space. Mercer stepped closer, boots silent on the polished concrete, his eyes scanning Kane not with curiosity, but with calculation, the way one might assess an unexpected variable in a system designed to eliminate them. "You lost, sir?" he asked. The word "sir" flattened into something closer to an afterthought than respect. Kane didn't answer. His pale blue eyes drifted once across the room, not lingering on the men, not drawn to the weapons or the screens, but to the map itself, as if reading something beneath its surface. The room felt it before anyone acknowledged it, a subtle shift, like pressure changing before a storm, but Mercer only saw defiance wrapped in silence. "This is a restricted compartment," he continued, his tone tightening, each word placed with deliberate authority. "No clearance, no entry. That's not a suggestion." A few of the operators exchanged brief glances, not out of doubt, but out of the faint discomfort that comes when something doesn't align with expectation. Kane adjusted his grip on the cane, the metal giving a soft, almost forgotten click against the floor, a small sound that seemed to carry farther than it should have in a room designed to absorb noise. Still, he said nothing. Mercer exhaled slowly through his nose, patience thinning but not yet gone, and turned slightly, as if addressing the room as much as the man. "We've got a live op in under 2 hours," he said, gesturing toward the map where grid lines and elevation markers pulsed faintly in layered data. "I don't have time for confusion or nostalgia tours." A quiet chuckle came from somewhere near the back, quickly stifled, the kind of reaction that fed on certainty, on the belief that everything in the room was understood. Kane's gaze remained fixed forward, his expression unchanged, not offended, not defensive, just still in a way that made movement around him feel louder than it was. Mercer turned back, closing the last few feet between them, his presence now direct, unmistakable. "I'll ask once," he said, voice lower, sharper. "Who authorized you to be here?" For a moment, it seemed like the question might hang unanswered forever, suspended in that sealed space where rank, protocol, and reputation usually dictated the next move. Kane's eyes finally shifted, not up to Mercer's face, but past him, toward the far edge of the projection where a thin contour line bent slightly off pattern, a detail so small no one else had commented on it. His voice, when it came, was quiet, roughened by age but steady, carrying none of the urgency in the room, none of the tension. "Nobody needed to," he said. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't explanation. It was simply a statement, and somehow, that made it heavier than either. Mercer's jaw tightened just enough to be noticed, the first visible crack in a composure built on control. Around them, the room seemed to hold its breath without knowing why. The low hum of machines suddenly louder, the stillness sharper, as if something unseen had just stepped into the space with them. And for the first time since he walked in, Arthur Kane looked not like a man out of place, but like a presence that had been waiting for the room to catch up. Mercer held his position for a second longer than necessary, studying the old man as if the answer he had just given might rearrange itself into something more acceptable if he stared hard enough. But it did not. It simply remained there in the air, quiet and immovable. And that was what unsettled him most, because everything in this room was supposed to respond to pressure, to rank, to clarity. And yet Arthur Kane stood outside of all of it, like a fixed point no one had accounted for. And that was not how systems like this were built to operate. So Mercer shifted tactics, a subtle recalibration, his voice smoothing out just enough to regain control without appearing to lose it. All right, he said, nodding once as if granting the man a final chance to align with reality. Then we will make this simple. And he gestured toward a vacant chair along the wall, not an invitation but a placement, a way to contain what he did not understand. You can sit right there and stay out of the way while we finish the briefing. A few operators glanced toward the chair, then back to Kane, waiting to see if he would comply, because compliance would make this normal again. It would restore the expected order of things, but Kane did not move immediately, his gaze still resting on that faint bend in the contour line projected across the wall, a detail so small it might have been a rendering error, and yet the longer he looked at it, the more it seemed to matter, and finally, with the same measured economy that defined everything he did, he took one step forward, the cane touching down with that same soft metallic click, then another, until he reached the chair, but instead of sitting, he rested his hand on its back and remained standing, angled slightly toward the map, as if the mission itself had his attention more than the men assigned to it. Mercer's jaw tightened again, just a fraction. The second cracked, because this was not defiance in any way he could formally address. It was something quieter and far more difficult to correct, and behind him, Sergeant Luis Ortega shifted his weight, his eyes moving between Kane and the map, something in the old man's focus beginning to register in a way he could not yet explain. We are wheels up in 1 hour and 40 minutes, Mercer continued, turning back toward the projection, his voice reclaiming the rhythm of command. Primary insertion at grid echo 7, elevation 1200 feet, thermal. Variance expected along the ridge line. His hand moved across the digital terrain, highlighting approach vectors and fallback routes. The operators leaned in slightly, attention snapping back to the mission, to the familiar language of coordinates and contingencies, and for a moment, it worked. The room settled, the anomaly contained, until Kane spoke again, not loudly, not interrupting, but simply placing his words into the flow as if they belonged there. The ridge does not hold wind the way you think it does, he said, his eyes still on the map, and the sentence landed with a weight that did not match its volume. Mercer paused mid-gesture, just for a fraction of a second, then continued as if he had not heard it. Secondary extraction point remains unchanged, he said, but Ortega's head turned fully now, his attention locked on Kane. What did you say? He asked, the question slipping out before he could measure it. And for the first time, several others followed his gaze, the room tilting again, subtly but unmistakably. Kane did not look at Ortega when he answered. He simply lifted his chin a fraction toward the projection. That ridge, he said. It splits the current into 2 layers, surface and underflow. You will not see it on your instruments, but your insertion path crosses both. The words were delivered without emphasis, without any attempt to convince, and that was precisely what made them harder to dismiss. Mercer turned slowly now, fully facing him again, a different kind of focus in his eyes, sharper, more deliberate. And you know this how? He asked, and the question was no longer about protocol. It was about something else, something he had not intended to engage with. And for a brief moment, the room waited, balanced between skepticism and something closer to recognition, while Arthur Kane finally shifted his gaze from the map to Mercer, meeting his eyes with that same calm, unyielding stillness, as if the answer to that question had been decided a very long time ago and did not require explanation now. Mercer did not answer immediately, and that alone shifted something deeper than words, because in a room where responses were measured in seconds and certainty was expected, hesitation carried its own kind of gravity. He studied Arthur Kane again, but this time not as a misplaced civilian, not as a disruption to protocol, but as a variable that had just touched the mission itself, and that made it different. That made it personal. You are not on this team, Mercer said finally, his voice quieter now, controlled in a different way, less about authority and more about precision. And you are not on this operation, so I will ask you again, how do you know that terrain? The question settled into the space between them, sharper than before, because now it carried weight, now it mattered, and Kane did not rush to fill it. He let the silence stretch just long enough for the room to feel it, for the hum of the systems to rise again, for the operators to become aware of their own stillness. And then he answered, because I have seen it when it was not a map, he said, his voice even, not nostalgic, not dramatic, just factual. as if he were describing the weather, and a few of the men shifted slightly, subtle, almost imperceptible adjustments, but enough to register, because that was not the kind of answer you could easily categorize. Mercer exhaled once, slow, controlled, and turned back toward the projection, pulling the room with him. "We are not adjusting a mission profile based on something that cannot be verified," he said, his tone firm again, re-establishing structure. "We have satellite data. We have real-time atmospheric modeling. We have sensors do not see everything," Kane said quietly, not interrupting, not raising his voice, but placing the words with the same weight as before, and this time Mercer stopped completely, his hand lowering from the projection, the sentence cut short not by force, but by something more difficult to ignore. Ortega leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the ridge line again, then back at Kane, something clicking into place that he could not yet articulate. "There are two currents," Kane continued, his gaze returning to the map. "The upper flow shifts west at about 800 feet, but the lower pulls east along the rock face. It will push you off alignment if you trust the surface readings." His tone did not change, it did not need to, because the specificity itself carried authority, and now the room felt it. The difference between a guess and a memory. Mercer's eyes flicked to Ortega, just for a fraction of a second. A silent check, and Ortega did not speak. But his expression had already changed. The doubt was no longer directed at the old man. It was directed at the plan, and that was enough to alter the balance of the room. Mercer turned fully again, facing Kane with a new kind of focus, not hostile, not respectful yet, but attentive in a way he had not been before. "You are saying our insertion will drift," he said, and Kane gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Not drift," he replied. "Mislead." The word landed differently, heavier, more precise, and for a moment, no one moved. The projection continued to glow, the coordinates unchanged, the plan intact. And yet something invisible had already shifted, something that could not be measured by their instruments or corrected by a simple adjustment. Mercer straightened slightly, his posture resetting as if preparing to close the gap between uncertainty and control. "Then give me something I can use," he said, the challenge clear now, not dismissive, but direct. "A correction, a bearing, something that proves you are not guessing." And for the first time, Arthur Kane's hand moved from the back of the chair to the edge of the table beside him, his fingers resting lightly on the surface as he leaned in just enough to look closer at the map, the movement small, deliberate, and in that moment, the room did not see an old man stepping forward. It saw something else, something older than the technology around them, something that did not need to raise its voice to be heard. "Shift your entry point 20 yards south," Kane said, "and delay your descent by 4 seconds. He paused, just long enough for the numbers to settle into the minds of the men listening. "The wind will correct for you instead of against you." And when he finished, he leaned back again, returning to stillness as if nothing significant had just happened. But the room knew better now, even if no one said it yet, because silence had changed. It was no longer dismissal, it was consideration. The room did not move right away, and that was the first sign that something had shifted beyond control. Because Delta Force operators did not hesitate. They adapted, they recalculated, they executed, but they did not pause like this, suspended between action and doubt. Mercer stared at the map again, his eyes tracing the ridge line Kane had pointed out, then dropping to the numbers, 20 yards south, for seconds delay. Simple adjustments on the surface, but nothing about the way they had been delivered felt simple, and that was what pressed against his instincts, not the suggestion itself, but the certainty behind it, the kind that did not come from models or simulations. Ortega was already moving, not physically, but mentally, his gaze locked onto the elevation data, cross-referencing it with the thermal overlays, his fingers hovering near the tablet on the table, as if waiting for permission he had not yet been given. "Sir," he said carefully, not taking his eyes off the projection, "there is a variance here." The words were measured, chosen with precision, because in this room, saying something like that meant more than pointing out a detail. It meant challenging the plan. Mercer did not respond immediately, but his attention shifted, just enough to acknowledge it. Ortega continued. "The surface model shows a consistent westward drift, but the lower band," he paused, zooming in slightly, his brow tightening. It is unstable, it splits right along the rock face. The silence that followed was different now. Heavier, no longer built on dismissal, but on recognition, because what Kane had described without hesitation was now appearing in fragmented data, buried beneath layers the system had averaged out. Mercer stepped closer to the table, his presence narrowing, focused entirely on the projection. Run a localized simulation, he said, his voice low, controlled. Ortega nodded once and began inputting adjustments. The system responded with a quiet series of tones, recalculating vectors. The room leaned in almost imperceptibly, drawn toward the outcome. The seconds stretched. Then the new trajectory appeared, a thin line diverging from the original path, subtle, almost invisible unless you knew where to look, but enough to change the insertion angle by just over a degree, enough to matter. Mercer's eyes narrowed, not in disbelief, but in concentration. He watched the projected descent, the drift pattern, the correction, and for the first time since the old man had spoken, he did not dismiss it, he evaluated it. Ortega leaned back slightly, exhaling under his breath. It lines up, he said quietly, not as a declaration, but as a realization. The words settled into the room like a weight being placed on a scale that had just tipped. A few of the operators exchanged glances again, but this time there was no amusement, no quiet confidence, just a growing awareness that something they had overlooked had been seen by someone who should not have been here. Mercer straightened slowly, his posture recalibrating once more, but now it was different, not defensive, not dismissive, but deliberate. He turned back toward Kane, really looking at him now, not past him, not through him, but at him, as if trying to reconcile the man in front of him with the precision of what had just happened. You expect me to change an insertion plan based on that, he said, and the question was no longer rhetorical. It carried weight. It demanded something real in return. Kane did not react to the tone, did not shift under the scrutiny. He simply met Mercer's gaze with that same steady calm, the kind that did not rise to meet pressure because it did not recognize it as pressure. I expect you to decide if you want the wind to fight you, he said, his voice quiet, grounded, or carry you. And when he finished, he did not elaborate. He did not justify. He returned to stillness again, leaving the words where they were, and in that moment, the room understood something it had not before, that this was not a suggestion, it was a choice, and the weight of that choice now belonged to Mercer. Mercer did not speak for a long second, and that silence spread outward, settling over the room like a pressure front rolling in slow and heavy. Because every man there understood what had just happened even if no one had said it out loud. The plan they had trusted had just been quietly outmatched by a man who had not touched a single device. And that was not something Delta Force operators were trained to accept easily. Mercer exhaled through his nose, steady, controlled, then turned slightly toward Ortega. Apply the adjustment, he said, and the words were simple, but the shift behind them was not. Ortega did not hesitate this time, his fingers moving across the tablet with renewed certainty, locking in the 20-yard shift, adjusting the descent timing by 4 seconds. The system recalculated again, but now it was not searching, it was confirming, and the new insertion path stabilized in a way the previous one had not, subtle, but unmistakable, the kind of correction that removed friction you did not know was there until it was gone. Mercer watched it for another moment, then gave a short nod. Decision made. That is our entry, he said, and with that, the room realigned, operators adjusting their mental models, recalibrating expectations, but the presence of Arthur Kane did not fade back into the background the way it had before. It remained, anchored in the center of the space in a way that could not be ignored anymore. Mercer turned back to him fully now, his posture squared, not aggressive, not welcoming, but direct in a way that carried a different kind of weight. You still have not answered my question, he said, his voice lower, more focused than before. How do you know this terrain? And this time the room did not dismiss the question as routine, it leaned into it, because now the answer mattered. Kane stood as he had before, one hand resting lightly on the cane, shoulders relaxed, eyes steady, and for a brief moment it seemed like he might not answer again, that he might let the silence hold its ground. But then his gaze shifted, not to Mercer, not to the operators, but to the far edge of the room where a sealed equipment locker sat against the wall, its surface marked by years of use, faint scratches catching the overhead light in thin, uneven lines. Because I learned it when it did not forgive mistakes, he said, and the sentence was quiet, almost understated, but something in it carried weight that did not belong to theory or training simulations. Something older, something earned. Ortega's brow furrowed slightly, his eyes narrowing as he looked at Kane more closely now, not at his clothes, not at the cane, but at the way he stood, the way he held himself without tension, without the need to prove anything, a stillness that did not come from age, but from experience layered so deep it no longer needed to be displayed. Mercer held his gaze for a moment longer, searching for something, a crack, a hesitation, anything that would return this to a known pattern. But there was none, only that same steady presence. And that was what made him shift direction again, not in surrender, but in recognition that the equation had changed. Fine, he said, a single word, clipped but controlled. Then let us simplify this. He stepped closer, just enough to close the distance without crowding it. His eyes locked on Kane now with full attention. If you know the terrain that well, he continued, then you had a unit. The statement hung there, not a question yet, but leading to one. And for the first time since the old man had entered the room, there was a subtle tightening in the air, a different kind of tension, not about the mission, not about the plan, but about something deeper, something personal. Mercer's voice dropped slightly, deliberate, measured. What was your call sign? And when he asked it, the room went still again. But this time it was not confusion or doubt that held it there. It was anticipation, because now, whether they realized it fully or not, every man in that room understood that whatever answer came next was not going to stay small. The question did not echo. It settled, heavy and deliberate, as if the room itself understood that whatever came next would not be just an answer, but a revelation. And for a moment Arthur Kane did not respond, not out of hesitation, not out of resistance, but because silence had always been his first language, and in that silence the men around him became acutely aware of everything else, the low hum of ventilation, the faint electric pulse of the projection, the almost imperceptible shift of weight from one operator to another. Mercer held his gaze, steady, unblinking, waiting not with impatience but with intent, because now he knew the question mattered, and across the table Ortega felt it too, something tightening in his chest, a recognition that had not fully formed but was already pressing against the edges of memory. Kane finally moved, not forward, not back, just a slight lift of his chin as his eyes met Mercer's directly. And when he spoke, his voice did not rise, it did not carry force. It simply existed with a clarity that cut through the room more effectively than volume ever could. Titan 3, he said, and the words landed with a precision that did not need emphasis. They were not delivered like a title, not offered like a claim. They were stated like a fact that had long ago stopped needing to be explained. And for a fraction of a second nothing happened, no reaction, no visible shift, just the continuation of stillness, the kind that follows something that has not yet been understood. Mercer's expression did not change immediately, his training holding the line, categorizing, searching, but Ortega's did. His eyes flickered once, sharp, involuntary, as if something buried deep had just surfaced without permission. His gaze dropped to the tablet, fingers moving almost instinctively, pulling up a restricted archive he had not accessed in years. The interface resisted for half a second, then opened, and there it was, not highlighted, not marked for easy recognition, just a designation buried in layers of operational history. Titan 3, flagged, redacted, referenced in briefings that were never spoken aloud. Ortega's breath slowed, his posture shifting as realization took hold, and around the room, the change began to spread, subtle at first, one operator straightening slightly, another turning his head just enough to catch Ortega's expression, the ripple moving outward without a word being spoken. Mercer noticed it. Of course he did. He always noticed shifts in his team, and now his eyes moved, not to Kane, but to Ortega, reading the reaction, measuring it. And what he saw there was not confusion, not doubt, but recognition edged with something close to disbelief. What is it? Mercer asked, his voice controlled but sharper now. Ortega hesitated for the briefest moment, not because he did not know, but because saying it out loud would make it real, and that carried weight. "Sir," he said quietly, lifting his eyes, "that designation, it is not supposed to be in circulation." The words were careful, chosen with precision, but they carried enough. Mercer's attention snapped back to Kane, recalibrating everything in an instant. The man in front of him was no longer an anomaly, no longer an interference. He was something else entirely, something that had just stepped out of a layer of history most of them only knew existed in fragments. Kane did not react to the shift, did not acknowledge the growing tension. He simply stood there, as he had from the beginning, grounded, unmoved, as if the weight now pressing into the room had always been there, and the others were only just catching up. Mercer took a slow step. Closer, not aggressive, not confrontational, but deliberate, the distance closing not to challenge, but to confirm, his voice lower now, stripped of everything unnecessary. "Say that again," he said, and this time it was not a demand, it was a request for certainty. Kane's eyes did not waver, his expression did not change, and when he repeated it, the room was ready, even if it did not want to be. "Titan 3, he said, and this time the silence that followed was not empty. It was full, dense with understanding, and no one in that room spoke because they no longer needed to. The name had already done the work. The silence did not break. It deepened, settling into the walls, into the steel, into the men themselves, because now the name was no longer just a sound. It was a weight, and each of them carried it differently. Ortega's screen remained open, the redacted file staring back at him like something that was never meant to be seen twice. His fingers hovered above it, but he did not scroll. He did not need to. He had already seen enough. Mercer stood still, his posture locked not by authority but by recalibration. Every assumption he had made since the moment the old man walked into the room had just been rewritten, and that was not something that happened often. Not here, not to him. A faint tone broke through the silence, sharp and precise, cutting across the room from the secure console near the far wall. Heads turned instinctively. One of the operators moved to it, his steps controlled but faster than before. He glanced at the screen, then straightened slightly, his voice lower when he spoke. "Sir, we have an incoming secure line." Mercer did not look away from Kane immediately, but when he did, it was deliberate, measured. He nodded once. "Put it through." The room shifted again, not chaotic, not rushed, but focused in a way that carried a different kind of tension. The operator tapped the console, and the speaker embedded in the ceiling came alive with a brief burst of static before resolving into a voice that did not need introduction, calm, authoritative, carrying the kind of weight that came from decades of command. "This is General Robert Hale." The words filled the room without effort, and every man there felt the immediate adjustment in posture that came with it. Mercer stepped closer to the console, his voice precise, controlled. "General, this is Staff Sergeant Mercer." There was no hesitation, no uncertainty, just direct acknowledgment. A brief pause followed, then Hale's voice again, slightly sharper now. "You have an individual in your briefing room." It was not a question. Mercer's eyes flicked toward Kane for a fraction of a second, then back to the console. "Yes, sir," Hale continued without pause. "I want you to listen very carefully." The tone shifted, not louder, but heavier, each word placed with intent. The man standing in that room is not to be questioned, delayed, or redirected. The air tightened instantly, operators exchanging brief glances, the confirmation landing harder than any speculation had. Mercer's jaw set slightly, not in resistance, but in acknowledgment of a chain of command that had just extended beyond the visible room. "Understood, sir," he replied. Hale did not stop there. "If he speaks, you listen." The words came slower now, deliberate. "If he advises, you adjust." A brief pause followed, just long enough for the meaning to settle completely. "And if you are unsure why, that is because you were not there when it mattered." The line went quiet for half a second. Then Hale added one final sentence, softer but somehow more final. "I was." And the connection cut cleanly, leaving the room in a silence that was no longer uncertain. It was defined. Mercer stood still for a moment, absorbing it, not as a challenge, not as a disruption, but as a directive that had just reframed everything. Then he turned, slowly, fully, back toward Arthur Kane. And this time there was no trace of dismissal, No edge of skepticism, only clarity. He took one step forward, then another, closing the distance with measured intent, and when he stopped, he did something no one in the room had expected, not because it was dramatic, but because it was precise. He brought his posture to full alignment, shoulders squared, chin level, and raised his hand in a clean, controlled salute, the movement exact, unhurried, and absolute. The rest of the room followed a fraction of a second later, not out of imitation, but because they understood, because now there was no ambiguity left, and Arthur Kane did not return the salute immediately. He simply stood there, looking at them, not with pride, not with satisfaction, but with a quiet recognition that did not need acknowledgment to exist. And when he finally inclined his head just slightly, it was enough, more than enough, because in that moment, the room had already given him what it should have from the beginning, not permission, not approval, but respect. The salute did not linger, it resolved, clean and precise, and as Mercer lowered his hand the room followed, but nothing returned to what it had been before, because something fundamental had shifted and could not be undone. Arthur Kane remained where he was for a moment longer. Then his gaze drifted back to the projection on the wall, as if the entire exchange had been nothing more than a brief interruption. His voice, when it came, carried the same quiet steadiness it always had. "Your window closes faster than you think," he said, and the words moved through the room with purpose, no longer questioned, no longer filtered through doubt. Mercer turned slightly, already aligning with it. "Adjust the launch timeline by 3 minutes," he ordered, and the team moved instantly, not with urgency born of pressure, but with clarity born of trust. Ortega's hands returned to the tablet, locking in the final parameters. Operators stepping into position, confirming gear, syncing comms. The room coming alive again, but with a different energy, sharper, cleaner, anchored by something they had not had before. And through it all, Kane did not direct, did not oversee. He simply watched the map, as if the terrain itself was speaking to him in a language none of them had yet learned. Mercer finished issuing his orders and turned back one last time, not to question, not to challenge, but to acknowledge. "We are wheels up in 90 minutes, he said, his tone firm, grounded. Kane gave a small nod, the kind that carried more meaning than any extended exchange. Then he shifted his weight slightly, the cane touching the floor with that same quiet metallic sound, and began to move toward the door, not hurried, not delayed, just steady, as if his part in this had already been completed long before he arrived. Ortega watched him go, something still turning in his mind. "Sir," he said quietly, glancing at Mercer. "The file? It is almost entirely redacted." Mercer did not look away from the door, his eyes following the old man's measured steps. "It is not for us to read," he replied. And there was no frustration in his voice, only acceptance, because now he understood that some things were not meant to be fully known, only respected. The door opened with a soft release, and for a brief second the corridor beyond appeared, brighter, less controlled. Then Kane stepped through it and was gone, the door sealing behind him with the same quiet finality it always had, but this time it felt different, as if something significant had just passed through it and left an imprint behind. The room stood still for a moment longer, not out of confusion, not out of hesitation, but out of recognition. Mercer finally turned back to the team, his posture resetting, but not to what it had been before. This was something new, something informed. "You heard the correction," he said, his voice steady, carrying across the room. "We execute exactly as briefed." Heads nodded. No questions, no doubt, just alignment. Because now the plan was no longer just theirs. It carried something older, something proven, something that had already endured conditions none of them had faced yet. The projection continued to glow, the adjusted path steady and precise. And as the operators moved into final preparation, there was no need to speak about what had happened, no need to explain it, because they all felt it in the same way, a quiet certainty settling into place where uncertainty had been. And somewhere beyond the sealed walls of the room, Arthur Kane moved down the corridor, just another old man with a worn cane and a faded jacket, unnoticed by most, unremarkable to those who did not know what to look for. But inside that room, inside those men, his presence remained, not as a story, not as a legend spoken aloud, but as a standard, Something measured not in words or rank, but in the quiet, undeniable weight of experience. And long after the mission would be complete, long after the details would fade into routine reports and classified archives, there would remain a single moment none of them would forget, the moment when a room full of the most capable men in the world fell completely silent, not out of fear, not out of confusion, but out of recognition, because respect, once earned at that level, did not need to be repeated, it simply stayed.